Hello, everybody. This is the first of a few videos that is intended to give you a little bit of a springboard into our research area, which our area is heat stress and pregnancy. But I think it's really important to be able to contextualize the research that we're doing. And so this video is just going to be a very high level introduction to heat stress in general. So I'm going to start by saying that the human body is absolutely incredible. We can survive a really wide range of temperatures. And that's because we're homeotherms. And that means that despite changes in the environment around us, for the most part, we are able to maintain a stable core body temperature within us. And it's within a very narrow range. That's about 36.5 degrees Celsius, 37 degrees, 37.5 degrees Celsius. And I'm going to say that I will be sharing temperatures in degrees Celsius just because that is the SI unit for temperature, and it's the standard in science and medicine. But where it's useful, feel free to add your own little translations in your notes. But yeah, as I was saying, humans are homeotherms. So we need to maintain a core stable body temperature despite our environment. And we have been very intelligent and we've been able to adapt pretty extreme environments to be able to achieve this. So for example, I think on the International Space Station, they actually rotate about every 90 minutes between being at negative 150 degrees Celsius to positive 150 degrees Celsius. And their little tin can is maintaining a stable environment for them inside so that their bodies don't have to do as much work to keep their core body temperatures at a stable temperature. And then when it comes to living in more normal circumstances, if you can say that, I think that in Antarctica, where they've set up stations, it's between about negative 60 and negative 90 degrees Celsius that people have managed to work. And I think that there are debates for where the highest recorded temperatures have been on Earth. But I think it's Death Valley that wins out with about 56 degrees Celsius. So I like to say, like, humans have found ways to adapt our environments so that we can survive pretty drastic changes in temperature. But that really is with the key point being because we found ways to adapt our environments, right? We're homeotherms and we do it both homeostatically. We regulate our temperature homeostatically, that's within our body, but also environmentally by adapting our environments. So if we've been able to like adapt to these extreme environments, then why is heat stress such a big deal? Well, it turns out that heat is one of the leading causes of weather-related deaths. In fact, from 1998 to 2017, heat waves were responsible for more deaths than hurricanes, floods, and tornadoes combined. And in 2021, the World Health Organization declared climate change to be one of the biggest health threats facing humanity. Granted, heat was only like one component of that, but I still think it just indicates the severity of the issues that we are attempting to research and learn about. So if humans have been able to survive such a wide range of ambient temperatures, like I mentioned a couple of slides ago, how is it that we are so susceptible physiologically to heat stress? And the answer I sort of touched on it is just that even a very slight failure to maintain our internal body temperature within that narrow window, even as little as about 3 degrees Celsius, that can lead to severe injury and ultimately the risk of death. And so I think it's actually at about like 41 degrees Celsius that the life-threatening conditions start to occur. But just to show you that it really is such a small deviation that can cause such extreme harm. There's a really interesting calculation that found that during normal exercise, if heat couldn't be liberated from the skin, that just 10 minutes of normal exercise would push someone into the upper safe limits where they start to be at risk of heat injury. And so it's easy to say all of these things, but before we go further, I wanted us to start out with a really clear visual of what heat stress looks like. And I've intentionally chosen an example in a very able-bodied person because what we're going to be looking at really is in much more vulnerable populations with a lot less access to tools to be able to help environmentally regulate temperature. And so I think it's helpful to kind of see how susceptible one of the best of us can be to heat stress, how vulnerable we can be made so quickly. So what I'm going to show you is a video of an athlete, Jonathan Brownlee, ending a triathlon. This was a few years ago, but in this race, at the end of the race, he's experiencing heat stress, and I'll break it down afterwards. But you'll see that he starts to be really disorientated. He loses his way. He starts to lose control over his muscles, and ultimately, at the end, he's just on the floor, and he needs help to be able to finish the race. But I think it's really helpful to get a clear visual of just how serious this can be, and also this is quite a moving video.
Johnny has to win and to be sure of taking the title. And right now he seems to have lost control of his legs, and this is worrying. Oh, and he's starting to slow, and there is a little way to go. There's half a K to go, and Johnny is running out of time, and he's losing his sense of direction. This is worrying. Oh, goodness me. This is a horrible sight. Jonathan Brownlee has lost it now and has staggered to a stop at the side of the course, and Alistair's stopped to help him along. And Alistair is going to try and carry his brother home. Dramatic scenes in Cozumel as the Olympic champion carries his younger brother towards the podium.
Oh my God, I cannot believe what we are seeing here, Matt. Is this allowed? Is he allowed to help his brother? You know, is that part of the rules? I'm not too sure. We've never seen anything like this before.
Unbelievable scenes. Unbelievable scenes in Cozumel. The Brownlee brothers arm in arm, but it's not by way of celebration. Henry Schoeman's celebrating. He's going to win this race in Cozumel out of nowhere. But we have to be concerned about the health of Jonathan Brownlee, and they're not even on the final stretch yet. Schoeman wins in Cozumel. The brothers are coming home arm in arm to finish in second and third, but Johnny can hardly stand, and Alistair is having to drag him across the line and pushing him home for second. Johnny finishes in second. Goodness me, what an incredible conclusion here in Cozumel.
So as you can see, it's a really moving video, and I think it provides quite a strong visual of just how vulnerable the human body can become so quickly as soon as we start to deviate from that safe window that we have to keep our core body temperature within. After the race, doctors did confirm that Johnny was suffering from heat exhaustion. But that begs the question, what exactly is happening in his body? Well, firstly, he's finishing a race, right? So he already had a really high level of metabolic activity going on, because if you remember back to high school when we all learned about that powerhouse of the cell that produced ATP, one of the byproducts when it's producing ATP is also that it's producing heat. So he's needing a lot of energy in order to be able to power his muscles. And as a result, he's also producing a lot of heat in that process, right? And then secondly, there's just a really high ambient temperature that day. I've broken my own rule. I put the temperature in Fahrenheit. I apologize. But it was just a really hot day. I think it's about 34 degrees Celsius. And then to make matters worse, it was also a really high humidity day. So I think that they found that it was around 90% humidity that day. They're in Brazil, I believe. And the thing about humidity is it impairs the body's ability to cool itself through sweating. So sweating normally allows us to have the sweat evaporate off us as a gas. But whenever it's too hot, whenever the humidity is too high, what happens is it sticks to us as a fluid and it traps the heat. And so what I want to point out with this is that there are a number of factors that contribute to the experience of heat stress. So for example, just looking at the temperature alone does not indicate whether someone might be experiencing heat stress or not. We can't just pull out our phones, open the weather app and say, oh, look, this part of the world, people are experiencing heat stress. No, it is, heat stress is physiologically the experience of not being able to release heat at a sufficient rate that you maintain your core body temperature within that very narrow, safe range. And a number of factors play into that, from metabolic activity to ambient temperature, the amount of radiation that you're experiencing from the sun directly, and the humidity. So we've kind of looked at a very high level what was going on with heat exhaustion, but what was happening within his body? Well, as soon as the body detects an increase in core temperature in the hypothalamus, it starts to send signals to the sweat glands. And sweating is one of our primary ways of cooling down. And then the next thing that we start to do is we have an increase in vasodilation. So that is the opening of the blood vessels. And when we have cutaneous vasodilation, so that's vasodilation close to the skin, the blood supply in the skin increases from about 1% of our cardiac output to as much as 70% of our cardiac output. So that's going from the normal of about 300 milliliters per minute that's at the surface of our skin to about 7.5 liters per minute. So to put that into perspective, that is going from about a cup per minute to a couple of gallons of blood passing by the surface of the skin per minute. So you can imagine with such an increase in blood flow to the periphery, we're also going to see an accompanying increase in heart rate to be able to sustain this, right? We actually see an increase in heart rate and stroke volume to the point where in heat stress, your cardiac output will, it obviously varies by individual, but it's said to double. When we talk about it generally, your cardiac output is said to double. And this is really interesting because this is placing an increased demand on the cardiovascular system, and cardiac related issues are one of the primary causes of death or severe injury in heat stress. And so understanding a little bit of this systems level physiology really helps explain some of what we see epidemiologically. And then another thing that I want to point out that you also saw in the video of Johnny is just that there is a decrease in voluntary muscle activation. So you saw he was stumbling, right? He was struggling, and there reaches a point where your body just can't do it anymore. And this is because when we have that vasodilation to have blood flowing closer to the surface of the skin in order to be able to release heat, that comes at a cost. We're also redistributing blood away from the internal organs in order to be able to do that. And so there's this point where our muscles, our internal organs are just not getting the same amount of blood supply. And we'll talk about this more in future videos. That's going to be specific to our research, but this is just a good introduction to the idea. Okay, so we've gone over what's happening at the systems level, but what's going on at the cellular level? So the first thing that I want to talk about is protein denaturation. You might remember back in high school, you talk about like, oh, proteins denature due to various causes, and one of them is heat, and that's when we're cooking, we're denaturing proteins, and that's what happens when you fry an egg. Well, the same thing happens in our cells with all the proteins, right? The problem is that when cells experience protein denaturation, it actually leads to the collapse of critical cellular networks inside the cell. So we have these transport networks, and then we also have these actin filaments that also are acting as like a cytoskeletal structural support. And so not only are you having, sorry, I should have gone to the next point. So we have this protein denaturation. These proteins then start to aggregate, and then these aggregated proteins start to form clumps, and these clumps leads to disruption of these cytoskeletal transport networks, and also just the disruption of these networks also just means there's less structural support for the cell. So it's just not able to easily maintain the cellular integrity. And then the next thing that we have happening is an increase in reactive oxygen species. So you've probably heard of oxidative stress, and oxidative stress wreaks havoc on a number of things from proteins, lipids, DNA. But within the cell, the mitochondria are not only the organelle that are producing the most reactive oxygen species, they're also the organelle that is the most susceptible to damage by the reactive oxygen species. In fact, what actually happens is it reaches a point where there's so much, there's the level of oxidative stress builds up, and there's such a high level of reactive oxygen species that it starts to cause damage to the mitochondrial outer membrane. It starts to become permeable. And this is really key because there are two main apoptotic pathways. So you remember apoptosis is programmed cell death. That's key because in being programmed, it's one of the ways that does not lead to inflammation. It's one of the body's ways of getting rid of cells with the least inflammation possible. And there are two key pathways for it. And the intrinsic pathway happens because there's the release of this thing called cytochrome C from the mitochondria, that it's released from the mitochondria into the cytosol, and then that triggers the rest of the intrinsic pathway, ultimately leading to the activation of caspase 9. And I'm mentioning caspase 9 because I know a couple of you are going to end up looking at it in your research, but if that's not you, you can ignore that for now. Just know that there's mitochondrial damage that can eventually lead to apoptosis via this random pathway I just mentioned. Okay, so last but not least, heat stress also causes DNA damage. And unfortunately, it's not just DNA damage that heat stress causes, but it's also an inhibition of the DNA repair mechanisms. So you can see that these are not inconsequential effects on the cell. Interestingly, not all cell types are affected in the same way. And especially interesting for us is that actually reproductive cells, the sperm cells and oocytes, are some of the most vulnerable cells in the body to heat stress. Okay, so that was a nice little overview. But zooming back out for a second, Jonathan Brownlee, unfortunately, is not a rare case. In fact, in the Tokyo Olympics, 1 in 100 athletes experienced a significant heat-related illness. And that meant that going into the Paris Olympics that have just happened, organizers were really concerned and having to be prepared. And one of the reasons that they took it so seriously is because since the last Olympic Games were hosted in Paris exactly 100 years ago, there has been a 3.1 degrees Celsius average increase in temperature. There's in the last 100 years, the average temperature in Paris has increased by 3.1 degrees Celsius, which is really scary when you think about the fact that for about a 0.5 degree increase in ambient temperature, there's an increase in heart rate by about 10 beats per minute. So going into the Paris Olympics, the organizers were really proactive and really concerned, and thankfully it actually went a lot better than Tokyo. But this is a significant enough of an issue that the United Nations Office for Disaster Relief has said that if the trends in temperature continue as they have been, that the Summer Olympics is no longer going to be able to be held in in a lot of parts of the world if it's held in July and August. And so it would require looking at places like Northern Europe and Canada and Russia, just because the risk to athletes' health is so severe. Yeah, so I really just want to emphasize that heat and heat associated with climate change is not a joke. As I mentioned earlier, the World Health Organization has said that climate change is the single biggest health threat facing humanity, and heat is the largest cause of death among weather-related deaths. But what is really unfortunate is that the people most affected by heat stress are in the areas that have the least access to resources to help them be able to cope with that heat stress. And they're also the populations that have contributed the least to climate change. It's really sad. Researchers have said that by the end of the century, if nothing changes, that extreme temperature deaths will be comparable to death rates from all cancers and all infectious diseases combined. And it's important to point out here that it is extreme temperature deaths, so that includes deaths from cold temperatures. But I think it's just important to note that in general, the risk of temperature-related deaths is not insignificant. It's also being shown that if nothing changes by the end of the century, the global cost of climate adaptation is estimated to be about 3.2% of GDP. That is the equivalent of losing almost the entire economic output of the UK or India every single year. So to finish up, I just want to share another fact, which is that the body uses up to 60% of energy generated during metabolic processes is used to maintain our body's temperature. So imagine if I said to you that 60% of a budget or 60% of someone's schedule was dedicated to one particular thing. You'd really want to inquire, like, what is this thing that so many resources are being dedicated towards, right? Well, our bodies are dedicating 60% of the energy generated from metabolic processes to maintaining our body's temperatures. So this is not a trivial thing. And I think that, especially in the context of like thermal physiology, it's helpful to understand that, like, although, you know, we're hearing about cancer every day, we hear about the flu and getting your vaccine or whatever, our bodies are putting an enormous amount of energy towards maintaining temperature for the sake of our health every single day. I think that is about all I have for this initial video. But I do have a very quick quiz to end on. Hopefully will be very easy at this point, despite the fact that it's a very sad answer. And that is, which of the following is a leading cause of weather-related deaths? Should be really easy for you right now. The answer is heat. Unfortunately, heat is responsible for more deaths than all other natural disasters combined. So I'm going to end there for this one. But hopefully that just gives you a very high-level overview and introduction to heat stress before we start to dive into the specifics for our project.